Hi students, and welcome to another e-lesson video. This one over an introduction to the Q3 argumentative essay. As with all of these e-lesson videos, please feel free to pause and rewind at any time to take notes, rewatch, or get caught up. Here's what's going to be on this video. We're going to talk just a quick refresher over the AP Lang free response section. Going to get into the writing task, what the Q3 asks you to do, and some planning and organizational strategies for the Q3, some good practices, and finally some bad practices on the Q3. So let's a reminder about the AP Lang free response section. The AP Lang exam consists of two sections: multiple choice section worth 45% of the score and a free response section worth 55% of the score. There are three free response or essay questions. The Q1 is the synthesis essay. The Q2 we've studied, the rhetorical analysis essay, and then finally the Q3 we're talking about here, the argumentative or persuasive essay. Timing on the essay, of course, on the essay section, you're given 15 minutes total for planning, where you're not allowed to write actual essays, and then 2 hours to actually compose the essays. And again, in that 15-minute time, you're just looking at the prompt booklet. You can't actually open your booklet of lined paper until the 15 minutes are up. Cool. All right, the writing task. Question 3 is what they call the free response question, which I've never really understood because the section is a free response section, but they call the question 3 a free response section. Essentially what question 3 is an argumentative prompt. You're writing a persuasive essay. You're given an issue to consider. The issue may be something concrete like a current debate going on right now, or some specific issue to defend, challenge, or qualify. Or it may be something abstract, like some philosophical question that needs examining. You're then asked to establish and develop a position on that issue. And let's look at some samples. I want to look at both something concrete and something abstract. Let's take a look at an example. Here's a concrete prompt here. It's something that demonstrates a concrete idea that you take a position on. It says, for years, corporations have sponsored high school sports. Their ads are found on the outfield fence at baseball parks or on the walls of the gymnasium, the football stadium, or even the locker room. Corporate logos are even found on players' uniforms. But some schools have moved beyond corporate sponsorship of sports to allowing, quote, corporate partners to place their names and ads on all kinds of school facilities, libraries, music rooms, cafeterias. Some schools accept money to require students to watch Channel 1, a news program that includes advertising. And schools often negotiate exclusive contracts with soft drink or clothing companies. Some people argue that corporate partnerships are a necessity for cash-strapped schools. Others argue that schools should provide an environment free from ads and corporate influence. Using appropriate evidence, write an essay in which you evaluate the pros and cons of corporate sponsorships for schools and indicate why you find one position more persuasive than the other. Okay. It's an example from back in 2008. It's essentially telling you to take a position within this debate because it's asking you to evaluate the pros and cons and then indicate why you find one more persuasive than the other. So you yourself have to be persuasive in demonstrating why your point of view is valid. And so that is an example of a very concrete issue, whether or not schools should allow corporate partnerships. So we're essentially defending and challenging, we're examining first of all the pros and cons, and then defending our point of view within that. Here's an example of something that's a lot less concrete, something that's more philosophical and abstract. Students typically struggle with these prompts a lot more than the others, but you see them every couple of years. They're not as common as the others, but once every 3 years really we get one of these. Here's what this kind of prompt looks like. Adversity has the effect of eliciting talents which in prosperous circumstances would have lain dormant. That's by the Roman poet Horace. Consider this quotation about adversity from the Roman poet Horace. Then write an essay that defends, challenges, or qualifies Horace's assertion about the role that adversity, financial or political hardship, danger, misfortune, etc., plays in developing a person's character. Support your argument with appropriate evidence from your reading, observation, or experience. So we have a differently worded prompt here, but again, it's develop a position regarding your opinions on Horace's quote here in how adversity plays a role in developing a person's character. So this one's a lot more philosophical. There's not really a concrete debate about this going on right now, unlike in the other prompt, and so it requires a little bit more critical thinking. This one's definitely a harder type of prompt. Let's talk about planning and organizing the essay. Of course, with all of these essays, there is little time to plan, but plan you must. You can't just start writing. When you're given the Q3, try to break the issue down, whatever the issue is, into sides and examine all of them. So in the instance of that Horace quote, you're going to want to break down the pros and cons, the merits and the detriments of what Horace has to say there, what he gets right, what he gets wrong, that sort of thing. And then once you've broken down the issue from all sides, take a position anywhere within that issue. Students often ask me, can we talk about both sides? Well, sure you can, as long as you develop a position in doing so. You cannot take two different positions, but if your position is in the middle of those two sides and you're still speaking to some greater truth, then of course you can kind of straddle the fence, so to say. But you cannot take two positions. You cannot take, say I agree with this position, I also agree equally with this position. That's not very strong. Once you've taken a position anywhere within this issue, you then need to outline precisely what you need to do in your essay in order to prove or to validate your position. Again, you'll do most of your planning in your head, but make sure that your pen is always moving while you're thinking up how to approach this essay. Jot down single-word short phrases on your prompt sheet, and when you're making your final decisions, like how to actually organize your paper, make sure you circle important elements and number them so that you can come back to them later. There are many ways you can organize your discussion in this persuasive essay. Just keep in mind that everything must contribute to validating your position, your thesis statement. And try to organize your argument so that it builds toward a logical conclusion. So do what you have been doing. Make sure that your introduction eases us into the discussion and indicates in that thesis statement what your position is, but still leave yourself room to sort of think it over and draw conclusions. A couple of common models for organizing an argument are the classical model and the Rogerian model that I wanted to introduce you to right now. The classical model is a model that the ancient Greeks developed, and it goes a little bit like this. You start with your introduction, which introduces the topic and indicates your position. Next, the next section after you've introduced the topics is what the Greeks called narration, where you provide relevant background material and establish any key definitions that must be established up front before you can move on. Here is where you also explain what your audience needs to know about the issue before you make your case. So it's the background stuff and the kind of assumptions you need to outline and decide on before you can start arguing. Next comes your confirmation. This is where you actually build your argument. You state claims, support them with reasoning. Then your refutation. This is where you take time out of your text to examine opposing views, concede and refute them, before finally moving into your conclusion, where you draw your conclusion and fully reveal your position. So that's how the classical model works there. Introduction, then the background information, the narration, the confirmation where you build your case, the refutation where you examine counter arguments, you concede and refute things, and then your conclusion at the end. Yeah, and of course, if your conclusion naturally has a call to action, go ahead and include that in your conclusion as well. Here we go. The Rogerian model, very different sort of model. The Rogerian model is more heavily focused on making concessions and acknowledging your understanding of the other side and being fair to the other side. In the Rogerian model, you begin again with an introduction that introduces your topic, but you always want to, using the Rogerian model, in your intro, go ahead and acknowledge the opposition's views, as well as, of course, indicating your position in your thesis statement. Notice how I say indicate your position. Don't fully reveal it. You leave yourself room to draw conclusions. Next, after your introduction, you want to outline the opposing views that you are aware of. Try to provide summary of the opposing views and explain the context in which these views are valid. That's what you want. You want to concede as much as you can to the opponent and remain fair in doing so. Carl Rogers is the guy who developed this. Carl Rogers was actually a psychologist, and he studied argumentation from that standpoint, and he believed that the more concession we can make, the more we do to bring our opponents into an acceptable state of mind. That is a state of mind where they're ready to talk to us, they're ready to agree with what we have to say, that is paramount. So putting them in that state of mind up front will help us then do the next thing, where we explicate our own views. This is where we build our argument, we state claims and support them with reasoning. and we make sure that throughout we always want to address fairly our issues with the opponent's views. So if we're arguing against the opponent's views directly, we want to make sure we treat the opponent's views fairly once again. And then finally, the conclusion. This is where you draw your conclusion. In a Rogerian argument, you always want to explain how opponents would benefit from adopting your position. Again, it all ties back into trying to help your opponent understand by acknowledging the merits of their argument, but just explaining how they would actually benefit from your argument. And if you possibly can, show them how your argument can actually complement theirs. Where their argument may fail, yours can help them achieve what they still want. That sort of thing. Yeah, just said that. Cool. In the end, though, you don't have to choose one model over the other. You don't have to organize yours in a classical model or Rogerian model. Your organization is yours. Just remember that an effective and engaging essay should resemble your thought process as you grapple with an issue and ultimately arrive at a conclusion. Don't simply draw your conclusions all up front and then spend the rest of your paper explaining why you are right. This inevitably leads to a very myopic or narrow-minded discussion and feels more like an exercise than an essay. Just make sure that your essay features these things. You got to have an introduction where you ease your reader into the topic and indicate your position. You have to, somewhere in your essay, explain any ambiguous terms or support for any disputable assumptions. You have to come to terms, so to speak, with your audience so they know up front what you mean by good, what you mean by better, what you mean by just and unjust, those sorts of things. And you get out of the way all of the assumptions the major assumptions that your argument relies on. Your essay must feature multiple arguments, claims with support, which help develop your position. You've got to acknowledge the other side, either like the classical model does, where you set aside a paragraph at the end, or the Rogerian model does, where you get it out of the way up front, or weaving it throughout your claims and support. You can certainly make an argument, then concede something, and keep supporting your argument. You can weave it throughout just fine. And then finally, of course, you've got to have a conclusion where you fully explain your position and draw your specific conclusions. All right, just some helpful hints, some good practices. Good practices start with using the Tolman model sentence to plan the logic of your main arguments. Your essay should be argument-driven, not evidence-driven. So when you first start approaching how you're going to justify your position, try planning it out using Tolman statements. Plan out the logic of your argument before you start looking for any examples that you can pull from history or literature or anything like that. Next one kind of is related to that. Good practice using pertinent examples to help illustrate your reasoning. Pull examples from current events, from history, from literature, from other observations that you've made. Hypothetical situations and analogies can also help illustrate, but be careful with these because they can be kind of flawed. Hypothetical situations, if you put them together unrealistically, you're almost creating sort of a, not really a straw man, but it's kind of like a straw man. You're creating such a favorable situation, but it's just going to be looked at as a pure contrivance for the sake of justifying your argument. Also, be careful of analogies, as we've talked about with our unit on fallacious reasoning. And one last thing, remember, the examples you pull in support of your arguments, they should support your reasoning, not replace it. Far too many students will try to create an essay built purely on examples. They'll start thinking of, ooh, here's my opinion. What did I learn about an APUSH that can support this? What have I read about an AP Lang that can support this? Well, that's not really how you should approach this essay at all. Far too many students will say, you know, here is something that is true because of what happened in World War I, because of this thing that Woodrow Wilson did, and then just leave it at that and not really explain to me the reasoning behind it. Examples should support your reasoning, not replace it. You should use logic to reason out why your claims are true, and then support that reasoning, illustrate that reasoning with pertinent examples. Yeah. Here's another good practice, bringing in the ideas of other authors to supplement your discussion. We've read a lot of things this year written by a lot of influential people. So try to bring some of this into your discussion. I can really just see a reader now reading about the, nth just terrible paper, because a lot of these papers are really just saying the same things over and over again. And then if you brought in somehow something that Thoreau said, or something from Plato's Myth of the Cave that you could discuss, that would just really be kind of refreshing to these poor AP readers, of which I'm one. So bring some of this stuff that we've read into your discussion as support for your arguments, as illustration of your arguments. You can also bring it in as starting points for your counter arguments. While Steinbeck seems to indicate this in Grapes of Wrath with such and such thing from Grapes of Wrath, here is what he got wrong, that sort of thing. You know, you could always use it as counter argument material. Yeah, just use things that we've read to further illustrate any idea that you put down in your paper, and that can add a lot to your ethos. Finally, good practices, employing rhetorical strategies of your own. We study rhetoric first for a reason. It's so that you can start using some of the strategies we've analyzed in your own persuasive pieces. Remember, your argument, your logos must be central, but supplement your logos with building and maintaining credibility, your ethos. And then finally, don't forget to try to work in measured, relevant emotional appeals, your pathos. Bad practices. Let's talk about things you shouldn't do. First bad practice, hoping examples will make your argument for you. It just doesn't work that way. There's such the inductive gap is so big that we really can't be overcome. It becomes a logical fallacy. Keep in mind, essays should be argument-driven, not example-driven. Don't just rely on your examples to make your case for you. Actually, line out your logic. Explain your reasoning. Yeah, reasoning must be provided. The examples should only help illustrate the reasoning you provide. Another bad practice, providing insufficient, irrelevant, and or inaccurate evidence. You want to provide multiple relevant, accurate instances to support any inductive argument. A big problem that we see when we grade these papers are a student will claim something and then refer to one thing that President Woodrow Wilson did back in World War I. They'll cite like one thing that he did and just assume that's enough. Well, that's like one instance. Perhaps cite something that he did in that instance, something that FDR did during World War II, something that Kennedy or LBJ did during Vietnam. That starts building a broader body of evidence. So make sure that you provide multiple relevant, accurate instances to support any inductive argument. In deduction, make sure your premises and assumptions are reasonably true and that your conclusions follow from them in that deductive argument. Otherwise, it's just not good reasoning, and you've got logical fallacies. Bad practices, spending a lot of words explaining the context behind a historical or literary example. I see this all the time. A student wants to use an example from the American Revolution, and then they tell me, you know, in 1776, Thomas Jefferson, blah, 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 and then they spend the whole freaking rest of the page telling me all of the events that led up to the thing that they want to use as their example. That's not building ethos, that's wasting space. So be brief in setting up the historical illustrations or literary illustrations that you want to use. Just get to the point. Your paper must be focused on persuasion, not on exposition. Yeah, exposition and narration are necessary to kind of get me to understand what you're talking about, but if you spend half the page just talking about narration, like all the events that led up to the Great Depression, ask yourself, is this necessary to persuasion, or can I just skip to the end? That sort of thing. Okay. Finally, bringing in examples which diminish your credibility. Don't bring in examples which might be detrimental to your own ethos. Personal anecdotes can be illustrative, and they're often very well received in an introduction, into your introduction paragraph, but they lack forceful support of any conclusion. Just because something happened to you is often not enough to support a conclusion. So be careful when you use personal anecdotes. Use them to illustrate concepts, sure, but don't use them to support any kind of reasoning. Yeah, the same goes for examples from popular media. If you're trying, we say use historical, literary examples, current events, that sort of thing. By literary examples, we really don't mean things like, comic books or Harry Potter novels, those sorts of things. We could debate the literary merit of those all day long, but the fact is they're not recognized as forceful enough to really get your message across, to really build your ethos. So try to stick to literary canon, acknowledged authors with authority on an issue, that sort of thing. Yeah, don't bring in your examples from Harry Potter when you're discussing things like, I don't know, some economic trends or anything like that. Don't just try to shoehorn things in that don't really make sense, or things that would kind of diminish your ethos. All right, that's all I have for this introduction to Q3 argumentative essay. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to rewind and watch again if you missed something. Go ahead and move on to the assignment that's right beneath this video, and I'll see you in class. Thanks.